Two police cars stopped a Ducati Panigale V4 in the middle of a Manhattan avenue on a warm night in late summer. The woman riding it removed her helmet slowly and asked, in a calm voice, what she had done wrong. One officer ordered her off the bike before she finished the sentence. When she reached into her jacket and produced a federal judicial identification card, he laughed in her face, snatched it from her hand, and cuffed her in front of dozens of strangers on the sidewalk. Nobody standing there that night knew the woman in the black riding suit was federal judge Amara Whitlock, a woman quietly building a case against a corruption ring hidden inside that very police department. When the officer leaned close and asked her, mockingly, who she thought she was, Amara only glanced at her watch and answered, without raising her voice, that he had just signed his own conviction. Amara Whitlock was 34 years old, and she had built a reputation inside the federal courthouse for a kind of stillness that unsettled attorneys far more than shouting ever could. She had spent a decade climbing from public defender to prosecutor to the bench, and in every room she entered, she carried the same unhurried precision, listening twice as much as she spoke, never raising her voice to prove a point she could make with silence instead. Away from the courthouse, almost no one knew the other half of her life. The garage 2 blocks from her apartment, where a red Ducati waited. The long rides she took after difficult verdicts to clear her head of everything the day had asked of her. On the road, she was no one's honor, no one's judge, simply a woman and a machine moving through the city at the hour when it belonged to almost nobody else. The avenue was almost empty at that hour, lit by amber streetlights and the glow of a pharmacy sign on the corner. Amara rode the way she always rode, low over the tank, unhurried, the red fairing of the Ducati catching light from passing windows. She wore all black, a fitted riding suit with no visible markings, a full-face helmet that hid everything about her except the outline of her posture. Nothing about her suggested wealth, status, or a courtroom. Nothing suggested she carried the authority of the federal government in the pocket of her jacket. She simply looked like a woman on a motorcycle, moving through the city at the end of a long week, the kind of rider people glanced at and then forgot. 2 patrol cars pulled out from a side street without warning, lights flashing red and blue across the pavement. Amara eased off the throttle and rolled to a stop at the curb, both boots down, engine idling low beneath her. Darius Vane climbed out of the lead car first, 42 years old, broad-shouldered, walking with the particular swagger of a man who had never once been questioned about how he used his badge. He approached the bike before his partner had even closed his door, and he told her, flatly, to get off the motorcycle. Amara stayed seated a moment longer than he expected, then swung her leg over and stood, hands visible, voice even. She asked him a simple question. What exactly had she violated? Darius didn't answer her directly. Instead, he circled the Ducati once, running his eyes over the frame, the plate, the exhaust, as though the machine itself were the offense. He asked for her license and registration. Amara reached into a small pouch at her hip and handed both over without a word. Colton Rusk, 31 years old, newer to the uniform, and visibly less comfortable with the tone his partner had set, took the documents and checked them against the terminal in the car. Everything came back clean, no warrants, no violations, a spotless record. Still, Darius kept pressing, circling back to her, his questions sliding away from the law and into something else entirely. He wanted to know why a woman like her was riding a motorcycle worth more than his yearly salary, alone, at night, dressed like she had somewhere important to disappear to. A cab slowed near the far curb, its driver leaning toward the open window to watch for a moment before continuing on, and somewhere behind them a door opened and closed at the pharmacy, a small bell chiming faintly against the otherwise quiet street. None of it seemed to register with Darius, whose attention stayed fixed entirely on Amara, on the motorcycle, on the story he had already decided to tell himself, about who she must be, and why she must be hiding something. Amara recognized the shift immediately. This was no longer about a traffic stop. She had spent years reading rooms for a living, watching juries, watching witnesses, watching men who thought their voice was the only one that mattered in a given space. She said nothing about what she noticed. She simply began memorizing details the way she had trained herself to. The badge number stitched above his pocket, the unit number on the side of the car, the small dashboard camera blinking its steady red light. Darius told her to remove her helmet fully, though she already had. She held it under one arm and looked at him without blinking. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the idle hum of 2 engines and the distant sound of a bus braking somewhere behind them. Darius broke the silence first, accusing her of resisting, though she had done nothing but stand still and answer his questions. Amara did not raise her voice. She only asked, evenly, what exactly she was resisting, since she had complied with every instruction given to her. Darius didn't like the question. He reached to his belt and pulled free a set of handcuffs, letting them dangle for a moment before he spoke again, telling her this was her last warning to cooperate. Amara looked down at the cuffs, then back up at his face, unhurried, almost curious. "You are certain you want to do this?" she asked him. Darius answered without hesitation. He was certain. Colton stepped closer at that point, quietly suggesting they had already confirmed everything checked out, and there was no real cause to escalate further. Darius waved him off without even turning his head, telling him to stand back and let a real officer handle it. The words landed harder on Colton than his partner probably intended, and he retreated a half step, jaw tight, saying nothing more, though something in his posture had already begun to shift. The first small crack in a partnership that had, until that night, never been questioned by either man. Amara noticed the exchange too, filing it away the same way she filed away badge numbers and camera angles, a small detail that would matter later, though neither officer understood that yet. The cuffs closed around her wrists, with a metallic click that seemed louder than it should have been on that quiet street. Colton hesitated for half a second before stepping in to help secure her, his eyes flicking toward the small crowd that had begun to gather near the corner, several of them lifting their phones to record what was happening. Amara did not pull away, did not raise her voice, did not offer the one piece of information that would have ended the encounter instantly. She simply let it happen, and in doing so she left everyone watching, including Colton, wondering why a woman with nothing to hide would choose silence over an easy way out. A woman near the pharmacy called out that the whole thing looked wrong, that the officers hadn't given a single real reason for any of it, and a man beside her muttered something about how fast the cuffs had come out for someone who never raised her voice once. Darius ignored them entirely, guiding Amara toward the open door of the patrol car with a hand at her elbow that was rougher than it needed to be. Colton noticed the small wince she didn't let reach her face, filed it away without comment, and found himself, for the first time that night, actively hoping his partner was wrong about all of it. The Ducati stood alone at the curb where they had left it, engine cooling, its red paint dulled slightly under the streetlight, an empty presence that seemed, to more than one bystander, to be waiting patiently for its rider to come back. Darius pressed forward with the accusation that she had resisted a lawful order, though nothing in the last 10 minutes supported that claim. Amara asked, calmly, what statute he believed she had broken, and what evidence supported the charge he was building in real time. He sneered at her, asking whether she intended to teach him the law from the back of a patrol car. She told him she had no interest in teaching him anything. She only wanted to know which law he thought he was standing on. The question landed harder than he expected, and his jaw tightened as he turned back toward the car, muttering that she would learn soon enough who was in control tonight. Colton, meanwhile, had gone quiet, working through the paperwork a second time, his eyes moving over each line, as though searching for the justification his partner clearly believed existed. There was none. Her identification was valid. Her registration was current. Her insurance was active. Nothing in the file gave them legal ground to detain her, let alone cuff her on a public street. He glanced at the dashboard camera, then at the small crowd still filming from the sidewalk, then at Amara, who stood with her wrists bound behind her, and an expression that gave away nothing at all. Darius asked her, almost as an afterthought, whether she understood exactly who she was speaking to. Amara answered simply that she did. He laughed, short and dismissive, certain the laugh would be the last word of the encounter. It was not. As Darius guided her toward the open door of the patrol car, her phone buzzed once inside her jacket pocket, the screen lighting faintly through the fabric. Colton caught the glow, and, out of habit more than suspicion, reached to silence it before it drew attention from the gathering crowd. The name on the screen read Nia Sterling, and beneath it a single line of text. Judge, we just found his name. Colton read it twice before he understood what he was looking at. He looked up at Amara, who had already turned her head just enough to see the screen herself, her expression unreadable, and then she looked past him, directly at Darius, with something in her eyes that had not been there a moment before. They brought her into the precinct through a side entrance, past a wall of commendation plaques, and a bulletin board, thick with outdated notices, and Darius made a point of announcing her arrival to every officer within earshot, calling her the sports bike girl in a tone meant to draw laughter. A few officers chuckled out of habit rather than agreement. Amara said nothing, walked where she was directed, sat where she was told to sit, her wrists still bound, her posture straight, her face composed in the same stillness that had unsettled Darius from the very first minute on the street. Colton lingered near the booking desk longer than necessary, flipping back through the printed report, searching again for something that would make sense of what they were doing. There was still nothing. No warrant, no outstanding charge, no traffic violation serious enough to justify an arrest, let alone the handcuffs still locked around her wrists. Darius leaned against the counter and told anyone listening that she would learn her lesson tonight. Amara, seated a few feet away, asked him plainly what lesson he meant. He answered that she should stop thinking she was special. She held his gaze for a long moment before responding, her voice quiet but unwavering, that she had never once thought she was special. Then, after a pause long enough to make the room uncomfortable, she added that she did, however, know the law extremely well. Darius's jaw flexed at that, and he ordered a search of her bag, more out of frustration than procedure, determined to find something, anything, that would justify the last 20 minutes. The contents were laid out on the counter, one at a time. A phone, a wallet, a set of keys stamped with the Ducati emblem, a single pen, a wristwatch with a simple leather band. Nothing illegal. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that gave Darius the leverage he was so clearly hunting for. Colton stood beside the counter, watching the items accumulate, feeling the weight of the situation shift with every empty pocket, every clean document, every answer she gave without flinching. He picked up her phone to begin the standard identity verification most departments required for an unnamed detainee, and as the screen lit up in his hand, an incoming call appeared across the top. 3 words that made his stomach drop before he even processed them fully. United States Attorney's Office. Colton froze where he stood, the phone suddenly heavier in his hand than it had any right to be. He set the phone down carefully, as though it might detonate, and pulled up the department's internal database instead, typing her name the way Darius had spelled it out from her license. The search returned nothing but a single line of red text across the screen, a restriction notice unlike anything he had encountered in his time on the force. Darius assumed it was a glitch, and told him to try again, still convinced this entire episode would end with her name buried somewhere ordinary. Colton typed it a second time, more carefully now, and the same warning appeared. Bolder, unmistakable, federal judiciary, restricted access. He read it twice before looking up at Amara, who sat with her hands still cuffed in her lap, watching him with the patience of someone who had expected this exact moment from the beginning. Colton asked her, quietly this time, for her full name, and she told him he had already seen it printed clearly enough. He typed it once more into a separate verification terminal, reserved for federal credential checks, and this time, the system did not merely restrict access, it flagged the query, and began printing a confirmation document without being asked. The printer beside the booking desk hummed to life, and every officer near the counter turned toward the sound. Darius stepped forward and tore the page free before Colton could reach it, scanning the words with visible disbelief. Amara Whitlock, United States federal judge. The room fell into a silence so complete that the printer's mechanical click seemed to echo off the walls. An older sergeant near the back of the room, who had said nothing during the entire encounter, quietly stepped away from the counter and disappeared down the hallway, unwilling to be anywhere near what was clearly about to unfold. Another officer picked up a phone and began dialing someone, though he stopped halfway through and set the receiver back down, uncertain who exactly he was supposed to call in a situation like this one. Darius's face lost its color in stages, the arrogance draining out of him, as the reality of the paper in his hands set in. Colton, meanwhile, had already pulled up something else, a detail buried far beneath the surface of the moment that no one else had thought to check. He found the date of Amara's judicial appointment, cross-referenced against an old, half-forgotten complaint filed years earlier, one that carried Darius's name attached to it, along with the name of a witness, and the exact street corner where that complaint had originated. It was the same corner where they had stopped her tonight. Colton stared at the screen, then at his partner, then at the judge, sitting calmly across the room, and understood, with a cold certainty, that nothing about this stop had been an accident. Amara let the silence stretch a moment longer before she finally spoke, her voice as level as it had been on the street 20 minutes earlier. She told them she now wanted to understand one thing clearly. Why, out of every night, out of every street, had the two of them chosen to stop her tonight? Neither officer answered. Darius set the printed page down slowly, as though it had grown too heavy to hold, and for the first time since the encounter began, he had absolutely nothing to say. What no one in that precinct understood yet was that Amara had been running a private investigation for the better part of a year, one that reached far beyond a single traffic stop on a quiet avenue. She had been tracing a pattern hidden inside the department itself, officers accepting payments they were never meant to receive, reports quietly altered after the fact, evidence that disappeared from lockers without explanation, arrests engineered to protect certain people while burying others, and a small circle of officers who moved through the city as though the law belonged to them personally rather than to the people they served. She revealed none of this to the room, not yet, offering only enough for the two men in front of her to understand a single, undeniable fact. They had just walked themselves directly into the center of a federal investigation, entirely by their own choice. The investigation had begun quietly, almost by accident, when a pattern surfaced across a handful of unrelated cases that crossed Amara's docket within the same season. Defendants with thin records suddenly facing charges built on evidence that appeared later than it should have. Witnesses who recanted statements after unexplained visits from officers no one had assigned to their case. She brought Nia Sterling into the work early, a federal investigator 39 years old, with a reputation for patience that matched Amara's own, and together they had spent months mapping connections that refused, at first, to form a clear shape. Bank records led nowhere until they didn't. Deleted footage led to backup servers no one thought still existed. Slowly, methodically, the outline of something larger than a handful of bad decisions began to surface. A structure built to protect itself, layer after layer, for longer than either of them wanted to admit. Her phone rang again, and this time she asked, calmly, for the cuffs to be removed so she could answer it. Colton complied without hesitation, and Darius did not object. She put the call on speaker, and Nia Sterling's voice filled the small room, steady and precise, informing Amara that a traffic camera 2 blocks from the stop had captured the entire encounter from start to finish, time-stamped and unedited. Darius visibly flinched at the words. He asked, almost desperately, to speak with someone above his pay grade, and within minutes the precinct's captain arrived, his uniform pressed, his manner smooth in the practiced way of a man used to smoothing things over. Captain Malcolm Graves, 51 years old, entered the room with an apology already forming on his lips before he had fully crossed the threshold. He addressed Amara by her title, before anyone in the room had spoken it aloud, offering his regrets for what he called an unfortunate misunderstanding between his officers and a member of the federal bench. Amara studied him for a long moment, letting his own words hang in the air longer than he was comfortable with. Then she asked him plainly how he had known her name before she had introduced herself to did. Every thread, when pulled far enough, connected back to a network larger than one officer, larger than one precinct, reaching into corners of the department that had operated in the dark for years without consequence. Darius, watching the walls close in around him, began to crack under the weight of what he had done. He understood, with sudden and brutal clarity, that Malcolm had never intended to protect him, that he had always been expendable, a convenient face for a much larger operation to hide behind. Colton, meanwhile, made his decision. He reached out to Amara directly, offering to hand over everything he had gathered, recordings, internal messages, anything that could help dismantle the structure Darius and Malcolm had built together. But before he could deliver the full weight of that evidence, Malcolm discovered what he was planning, and the confrontation that followed left no room for pretense on either side. Malcolm found Amara alone in a small conference room later that week, closing the door quietly behind him before crossing the space to stand directly in front of her desk. His voice, when he finally spoke, had lost the polished warmth of their earlier conversations, replaced by something colder and far more direct. He told her, plainly, that she had gone too far, that she was reaching into territory that would cost her more than she understood. Amara did not stand, did not raise her voice, did not so much as shift in her seat. She simply told him no, that she hadn't gone too far at all. Then she glanced at the watch on her wrist, unhurried, and told him she had only just begun. Malcolm's next move was to reach for the only tool he had left, the authority still attached to his rank, and he used it aggressively, ordering internal records sealed, and demanding that certain files be pulled from circulation before anyone outside the department could examine them. A handful of officers, loyal to him for reasons of their own, moved quickly to comply. What Malcolm did not know was that Amara had anticipated exactly this reaction days earlier, and copies of every relevant document had already been transmitted to federal offices well beyond his reach. By the time he realized his mistake, Nia was already walking through the precinct doors with a warrant that made further concealment impossible. Officers who had spent years watching Malcolm command a room with nothing more than a raised eyebrow now watched him plead, quietly at first, then with less and less restraint. As agents moved through the precinct pulling files from cabinets he had personally guaranteed were untouchable, Nia worked through the building with the same patience she had shown for months, cross-checking each seized document against the digital trail she and Amara had assembled, long before anyone in that building knew their names, confirming, one folder at a time, that nothing had been overlooked. A few officers who had never been part of the network stood in doorways and watched in silence, some of them realizing for the first time exactly how much had been happening around them without their knowledge, a discomfort that would follow many of them long after that afternoon ended. Cornered, Malcolm shifted tactics entirely, attempting to turn the narrative back onto Amara herself. He accused her of using her position on the federal bench to settle a personal grudge, suggesting the entire investigation had been born from resentment rather than justice. Amara let him finish before responding, her tone as even as it had been from the very first night on the avenue. If this were truly about revenge, she told him, he would not need to be quite this afraid of what she already had. The comment landed exactly where she intended it to, and Malcolm's composure, already thin, finally broke entirely. Darius, sensing the ground shifting permanently beneath him, offered a partial confession, admitting he had altered reports on at least 2 separate occasions under instructions he claimed came directly from Malcolm. It wasn't the full truth, but it was enough to start a chain reaction that neither man could stop. Colton followed with the recording he had promised Amara days earlier, a conversation captured on his own device in which Darius could be heard receiving explicit direction the night before the arrest. Piece by piece, the case that had once seemed impossible to prove assembled itself into something undeniable, airtight, ready for federal review. Just as the investigation seemed to be reaching its natural conclusion, Amara uncovered one final thread that complicated everything. A name buried deep in the financial trail led not to another officer, but to someone inside the federal prosecutor's office itself, a detail that meant the corruption reached higher and wider than she had initially believed. Nia called her that same evening, her voice tighter than usual, delivering news that changed the shape of everything they had built so far. Elias Mercer, the federal prosecutor who had been quietly aware of pieces of Amara's investigation from the beginning, had disappeared. Nia had spent 2 days searching, before locating Elias, working through contacts she rarely called on, favors she rarely asked for, driven by a growing certainty that his disappearance was connected to the same network they had been unraveling for months. She found him finally in a small apartment 2 boroughs away, staying with a cousin, refusing to answer his phone or return to his office until he understood exactly who around him could still be trusted. When Nia finally convinced him to speak with Amara directly, his voice on the phone carried none of the confidence expected of a federal prosecutor, only the exhaustion of a man who had spent weeks trying to decide whether silence or exposure carried the greater risk. Amara understood almost immediately that the scale of what she had uncovered was larger than a single precinct, larger even than Malcolm Graves and the small circle of officers protecting him. Elias Mercer, 47 years old, had been working alongside pieces of her investigation for months, careful and cautious, never revealing the full extent of what he knew. When Nia finally located him 2 days later, shaken but unharmed, his explanation reframed everything that had happened. He had not vanished to protect himself from Amara. He had been threatened, warned quietly by someone inside his own office that continuing to assist her would come at a personal cost he wasn't prepared to pay. Elias told her, in a voice stripped of its usual courtroom confidence, that the network she had uncovered was not new. It had existed for years, passed down through successive rotations of officers and officials, each generation learning to protect the one before it. Some had taken money directly, others had simply looked away when they should not have. Case files had been buried, not by accident, but by design. Evidence quietly erased whenever it threatened to expose the wrong name. Amara listened to all of it without interruption, letting the full weight of what he described settle over her before she spoke again. She understood, standing in her chambers that night with the city lights spread out below her window, that she now faced a choice larger than any single case she had presided over. She could contain the fallout, protect the reputation of institutions that had for years quietly protected the very people abusing them, or she could expose everything, regardless of how far the damage traveled or how many careers it ended along the way. Amara chose the truth, without hesitation, and set the process in motion the following morning. Darius was arrested within the week, the same handcuffs that had once closed around Amara's wrists, now closing around his own. Malcolm followed shortly after, his composure gone entirely by the time federal agents walked him out through the same precinct doors he had once commanded. Several other officers connected to the network were suspended pending further review, their names now attached permanently to a case that would not simply disappear with time. Colton, whose cooperation had been essential to unraveling the full extent of the operation, was protected from prosecution, in recognition of the choice he made when it would have been far easier to stay silent. The formal hearings stretched across several months, each one methodical, unhurried, conducted with the same restraint Amara had carried since the very first night on the avenue. Prosecutors laid out the financial trail piece by piece, the altered case files, the deleted footage, the pattern of arrests engineered to protect names that should never have been protected. Malcolm's attorneys argued for leniency, citing decades of service, but the evidence assembled by Nia left almost no room for argument, and the sentence handed down reflected the scope of what he had built, rather than the reputation he had spent a career constructing. Darius received a lighter term in exchange for his cooperation, though nothing about the proceedings felt like mercy to him, sitting in a courtroom, not unlike the one where Amara now presided over other people's futures every single day. The moment that stayed with everyone who witnessed it, though, came during Darius's final conversation with Amara before his transfer. He asked her, quietly, without the arrogance that had defined him from the beginning, why she hadn't simply told him who she was the moment he pulled her over. It would have ended everything in seconds. Amara looked at him for a long moment before answering, her voice carrying none of the anger he had expected, and none of the softness he hadn't. She told him that if she had said it immediately, he would have treated her differently, and she needed to know, without question, exactly how he would treat someone he believed had no power at all. Darius had no response to that. There wasn't one to give. Weeks passed before the full scope of the investigation became public, and when it did, the reaction across the city was immediate and loud, though not in the way anyone expected. Footage of the original stop resurfaced everywhere, played and replayed, dissected from every angle by people who had once assumed Amara was simply an ordinary woman, caught in an unfortunate encounter with the police. The department announced sweeping reforms in the days that followed, new oversight measures, new accountability structures, promises that would take years to prove true or false. Amara herself declined every invitation to speak publicly about what had happened, refusing interviews, refusing statements, refusing anything that resembled a victory lap. Editorials argued over what the footage meant, some insisting it proved a system finally holding itself accountable, others warning that one dismantled network changed little about the deeper habits that had allowed it to exist for so long in the first place. Amara read none of it closely, choosing instead to spend her evenings the way she always had, riding the empty stretches of the city after the courthouse emptied out for the day, the same red Ducati carrying her past the very corner where two officers had once decided her silence meant she had nothing to protect herself with. The corner looked the same as it always had, the pharmacy sign still buzzing faintly, the streetlights still catching the same amber glow, as though the night that changed so much for so many people had left no visible mark on the pavement at all. She returned instead to her courtroom the following Monday, exactly on schedule, her robe settled over her shoulders as she took her seat behind the bench like any other day. The cases in front of her that week had nothing to do with police corruption or motorcycles or handcuffs on a quiet avenue. They were ordinary disputes, ordinary people, ordinary law, and she gave each one the same careful attention she always had, without fanfare, without acknowledgement of the story that had, for a brief time, made her the center of the entire city's attention. Colton found her outside the courthouse one afternoon, several weeks later, waiting near the steps in plain clothes rather than his uniform. He told her he was sorry, that he wished he had spoken up sooner, that first night, rather than standing beside Darius while it happened. Amara studied him for a moment, before answering, her expression softer than it had been at any point during the investigation. She told him he had spoken up, later than he wanted to, perhaps, but he had spoken up when it mattered most, and that was not nothing. Colton asked, almost hesitantly, whether she thought he should stay on the force at all after everything that had happened. Amara considered the question carefully before responding. If he could remember, always, that the badge was a responsibility and never a privilege, then yes, she believed he could. Nia stopped by Amara's chambers that same week, not for work this time, simply to sit across from her for a few quiet minutes, the way they rarely allowed themselves to during the months the investigation consumed almost everything else in their lives. She asked Amara whether she regretted any part of how the whole thing had unfolded, letting Darius cuff her that first night, instead of ending it in seconds with a single sentence. Amara considered the question longer than Nia expected, watching the city lights begin to flicker on beyond the window before she answered. She said that a single sentence would have protected her that night, but it would have told her nothing true about the two men standing in front of her, and the case, in the end, had needed the truth far more than it had needed her comfort. Nia didn't press further. She simply nodded, understanding, the way she always had, exactly what Amara meant, without needing every word explained. She left him there on the courthouse steps and walked to where the Ducati waited at the curb, its red paint catching the late afternoon sun. She pulled her helmet on, the same way she had that first night, methodical, unhurried, and swung her leg over the seat as the engine came to life beneath her, with a low, steady growl. She pulled away from the courthouse without an escort, without security trailing behind her, without a single marker of the title she carried, just a woman on a motorcycle moving through the city the way she always had, long before anyone knew her name. At a red light 2 blocks from the courthouse, she came to a stop beside a traffic officer standing at the corner, his eyes catching the bike, then the rider, recognition, passing quietly across his face, as he realized exactly who sat astride the machine beside him. He said nothing, and neither did she. Amara simply gave him a small, even nod, the kind exchange between two people who understood something about each other without needing to say it aloud. He straightened slightly where he stood, something in his posture shifting under the weight of that small acknowledgement, as though the nod itself had reminded him of a version of the job worth holding on to more carefully from now on. Neither of them needed to say anything more than that. The light changed to green a moment later, and she rolled the throttle forward, the Ducati carrying her down the avenue and out of sight, unhurried, unafraid, exactly as she had been from the very first moment. 2 officers made the mistake of thinking her silence meant she had nothing behind it. The city closed in around her the way it always did once she was moving, buildings sliding past in long streaks of light, the engine's low growl the only sound that mattered for the next several miles. She thought, briefly, of the young officer on the corner, of Colton walking away from the courthouse steps with something steadier in his shoulders than he had carried that first night, of Darius, somewhere behind bars, finally learning the answer to a question he had never once thought to ask himself. She thought of Malcolm, whose polished authority had meant nothing the moment it was tested against evidence he couldn't talk his way around, and of Elias, rebuilding whatever trust he could after weeks of choosing fear over the truth. None of it slowed her down. She simply rode, the way she always had, long after the city had gone quiet, long after everyone else had gone home, carrying nothing with her, except the same steady calm that had carried her through every room she had ever walked into. Real power was never about people knowing who you are. It was always about how you treated the ones you believed could do nothing to you at all.